Elijah was a poor, kind-hearted young man who only dreamed of giving his mother and little sister a better life. When a billion-dollar lottery ticket unexpectedly changed everything, his joy was short-lived, betrayed and murdered by the very friends he once trusted. But 7 years later, fate takes an unimaginable turn. Elijah returns, as a 7-year-old boy named Nathan, carrying memories of a life stolen and a mission unfinished. What happens when a child begins to uncover the deadly truth behind his own death? Nathan wasn't like the other kids. Even as a toddler, there was something off, not in a bad way, just different. He hardly cried. He spoke early, but not about toys or cartoons. Instead, he'd sit quietly by the window, staring into the distance, and whisper things like, "It didn't look like this before." His parents, Paul and Emma, thought he had a wild imagination. Maybe he'd watched something strange on TV. Maybe he was gifted. But by the time Nathan turned 4, they couldn't explain it away anymore. One night, while Emma tucked him into bed, Nathan held her wrist and said softly, "You're kind, but you're not my real mother." Emma blinked, frozen in place. "What do you mean?" He looked at her as if it was obvious. "I had another mother. She cried a lot. I tried to make her laugh, but it was hard. And my sister, she was small and hungry. I worked hard for them." Emma stood, her face pale. She kissed his forehead and turned out the light, trying to shake the chill crawling up her spine. The next morning, he was back to normal, eating cereal, humming, kicking his feet against the table leg. But the stories didn't stop. Sometimes he would say, "They were my friends. I trusted them." Or, "They didn't like that I stayed clean." Once, while drawing with crayons, he muttered, "They took everything and left me in the dark." Paul, who rarely believed in anything beyond what he could touch, started paying closer attention. He began jotting down the odd phrases Nathan said in a little notebook. Not to take him seriously, but to remember, just in case. Then came the drawings. Nathan began sketching strange places. Streets with names that didn't exist in their town. A crumbling building with a broken neon sign that read Mart in red letters. A blue house with a tree stump in front. Always the same layout, always the same faces, 3 men. Smiling. Standing behind a man with curly hair, his back turned. "Who is that?" Paul asked, pointing to the curly-haired man. Nathan didn't look up from his coloring. "Me. Before." Paul's hand trembled. "Before what?" Nathan shrugged. "Before they ended me." The room fell quiet. Emma became withdrawn. She refused to talk about it anymore. "Don't feed it," she said. "Don't encourage the fantasy." But Nathan wasn't fantasizing. He was remembering. One afternoon, Paul overheard Nathan talking to himself in the garden. "I told them I didn't want their way. I told them I'd find my own. I never cheated, never stole. And still, I won." Paul stepped out quietly. "Won what?" Nathan turned to him, eyes clearer than any 7-year-old's had a right to be. "It doesn't matter now. I didn't get to spend it. They made sure of that." That night, Nathan handed Paul a folded piece of paper. Just a sketch. A street corner Paul had never seen, with a small signpost labeled Maple and 3rd. Paul didn't sleep. He lay beside Emma, staring at the ceiling, hearing his son's voice echo in his mind. "I worked hard. I stayed clean. But it wasn't enough." And for the first time, Paul began to believe that his son wasn't imagining anything. He was remembering something very real. It happened over breakfast, quiet, unprovoked. "I used to live in Westmere," Nathan said, tapping his spoon against his cereal bowl. Paul looked up from his newspaper. "What?" Nathan shrugged casually. "Before, when I had a different name." Emma froze mid-step, holding a glass of juice. "Nathan," she said carefully, "you've never even been to Westmere." "I know." He spooned more cereal into his mouth. "But I remember it." Neither parent spoke. Emma turned her back and walked into the kitchen a little too quickly. Paul just stared. That night, long after Emma had gone to bed, Paul pulled out a drawer from his study desk. At the back was a worn notebook, one he hadn't opened in months. It was filled with scattered things Nathan had said since he turned 5. Odd names, numbers, the drawing of a cracked blue house. Phrases like, "I didn't touch blood money," and "they laughed before they killed me." He'd once dismissed them as wild imagination, but lately, the details had begun to connect. Paul flipped through the pages again. Blue house. Fence is broken on the left. Lily cried when I didn't come back. My mum used to sell fruits near the road. And now Westmere. The name had never been mentioned before. Paul stared at the name scrawled in Nathan's childlike handwriting. Then he made a decision. The next morning he called his office. "I won't be in today," he said simply. He didn't tell Emma. By 9 a.m., he was on the road, heading for Westmere, a town just 40 minutes away. He didn't know what he expected to find. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. When he arrived, Paul parked near a narrow lane and began walking with purpose, glancing around until something familiar stopped him in his tracks. A blue house. The paint was peeling. The wooden fence on the left side had collapsed, just like Nathan had described. The front windows were cracked, and the mailbox hung open. Paul felt a chill crawl down his spine, but the house was clearly occupied. Toys on the porch, laundry fluttering on a line. A toddler peeked at him through the curtain. This wasn't Nathan's past family. He looked around and crossed the road. A fruit vendor sat under a green umbrella, slicing pawpaw. "Excuse me," Paul said. "That house there, the blue one, do you know who lived there before?" The woman squinted at the house. Yes, that family, gone years now. Single mother and her girl. Good people. Life was hard on them, especially after their son died. He was a good boy," she said regrettably. Paul's heart began to race. "Do you know where they went?" "They lost the house," the woman said. "Couldn't pay the rent. Maybe 6, 7 years now. The girl was a teenager. They stay at a shelter now. St. Agnes Shelter, 2 streets from here." Paul barely whispered a thank you before heading off. St. Agnes Shelter was modest, wedged between a mechanic's shop and a dusty convenience store. The building looked tired. The paint had faded, and the gate hung on one hinge. He stepped in, asked for the woman and daughter. A staff member pointed toward the open backyard. "They're over there. Quiet folks. Been through a lot." Paul turned the corner and stopped. A woman sat on a wooden stool, her back curved with wear. Her hair was streaked with gray, tied in a tired bun. She wore a faded green dress. Her hands worked mechanically, peeling oranges into a bowl. Beside her, a young woman, maybe 17 or 18, sat silently, eyes cast downward. She looked older than her age, with a face carved by time and loss. Her clothes were plain, too large, and her fingers trembled slightly as she tied up a plastic bag. Neither looked up. Paul's chest tightened. He didn't speak to them, just stood there watching. Then he turned and left. He drove home in silence, his fingers clenched on the steering wheel. Every word, every sketch, every whisper from Nathan echoed in his head. The blue house, the fruit stand, the girl named Lily. That evening, Emma was folding laundry when Paul came in. He looked pale, almost dazed. She raised a brow. "Where were you?" He sat slowly on the arm of the couch. "I went to Westmere." She paused. "Why?" "I needed to know if what Nathan said was real." His voice cracked. "It is." Emma stopped folding. "The house, the one he described, is there. Everything he said, the broken fence, the color, the street name. And the family? They're real, Emma. A woman and a daughter. They used to live there, but they lost the house 6 years ago. Now they're in a shelter, 2 streets away." Emma slowly sat down, her hands limp in her lap. "This isn't possible." Paul looked at her. He's never been to Westmere. He's never met those people. But he knew everything. Everything. Emma's voice trembled. Then, who is our son? Paul didn't blink. I don't know. She looked at him, fear in her eyes. What do we do? He exhaled deeply. He must have come to us for a reason, and I intend to follow this until I find out why. Paul sat on the edge of Nathan's bed, staring at the little boy who had suddenly become the most mysterious person he had ever known. Nathan sat up calmly, legs folded, his hands resting in his lap. The sunlight peeked in through the curtains, casting a warm glow on the boy's face. But nothing about this moment felt ordinary. Nathan, Paul began gently, I need to ask you something about the things you've been saying. Nathan looked up at his father without fear or confusion, just quiet understanding. You went to Westmere, didn't you? He asked. Paul blinked. How did you know? The conviction is written all over your face, Nathan said plainly. You found the street, the house, and them my mum and sister, from before. Then he took a deep breath. How are they doing? There was pain in his eyes. Paul took a breath, the weight of it all pressing hard on his chest. Nathan, how do you know these things? How is it possible? The boy looked down at his small hands, as if he was remembering a different time. I just remember. I didn't at first. When I was younger, the memories were like broken pictures. But as I grew older, they started making sense. I remember my life before I died, 7 years ago. It all makes sense now. Paul nodded slowly, motioning for Nathan to go on. I lived in Westmere. We were poor. My mum worked as a cleaner. My little sister was just 11. I never knew my dad. He left before I could even speak. So it was just the three of us. Nathan paused, his eyes growing distant. I used to carry bags at the bus station after school. It wasn't much, but I had to help. Mum had weak knees, and I couldn't let my sister go hungry. Paul swallowed the lump rising in his throat. I had 3 friends, Nathan continued. They were different. They didn't want to suffer like I did. They said they would do anything to be rich. Anything. I never agreed with them. They called me weak, foolish. Told me people like me stayed poor forever because we believed in honesty. What were their names? Paul asked quietly. Nathan didn't hesitate. Trevor, Sean, and Marcus. Paul's eyes widened. Can you describe them? Nathan nodded again. Trevor had a scar under his eye. He always wore expensive watches, even when we were broke. Sean talked too much. He had this laugh that was loud and fake. Marcus didn't say much, but he was always thinking. Watching people like a hawk. Paul leaned back in shock. He knew those names. Trevor Sullivan, the youngest senator in the country. Known for his sharp tongue and expensive taste. Sean Delaney, the real estate king who rose from the slums, now owning the largest properties in the capital. Marcus Gray, the quiet genius who built a billion-dollar tech company before the age of 30. Nathan, Paul whispered, do you know what you're saying? They killed me, the boy said simply. I won the lottery. Millions. I played it once just to prove a point. A joke. Then the numbers hit. Couldn't believe it. I cried. I laughed. I thought our lives would change forever. Paul could barely breathe. But my friends, Trevor, Sean, and Marcus, they couldn't stand it. They used to say I was too soft, too honest. That the world belonged to the bold. They couldn't accept that I, the one they mocked, now had what they were chasing. So, what did they do? Paul asked, his voice barely a whisper. Nathan looked at his father, eyes steady. They poisoned my drink. We were celebrating. I didn't see it coming. I trusted them. I thought they were happy for me. Paul stood up and began pacing. This is unbelievable. They killed you, took the money, and no one ever knew. Nathan nodded. They covered it well. They said I drowned. But I remember everything. The pain, the betrayal. And now, I'm back. Paul turned to face his son. Nathan, these men, they're powerful now. One is a senator, the others are billionaires. How can we prove what they did? How can we get them to confess? Nathan's expression was calm, but there was a flicker of something stronger beneath it. There's a way. They forgot one thing, me. I may be a boy now, but I remember things they thought were buried. Secrets, moments, words they spoke. And I remember something else. Something that could change everything. Paul leaned in. What is it? Nathan paused. I didn't tell them where I kept the winning ticket. I told them I lost it. They believed me. But I hid it. Somewhere safe. Somewhere only I could find. If we find it again, we'll have proof. And with that proof, we can make them face what they did. Paul stared at his son. This little boy with the voice of a man wronged. We'll find it, Paul said firmly. We'll get justice. For you and for them. Nathan nodded slowly. Then let's begin. Paul sat quietly in his study, the conversation with Nathan still ringing in his ears. The calm, confident way his 7-year-old son had described his past life. The betrayal, the pain, and finally, death. It was too real to ignore. Paul had seen the house. He had seen the old woman and the sad girl living in the shelter. And now he was certain. Nathan was not just an ordinary boy. He had come back to finish what was left undone. Paul walked back to the living room where his wife Emma was folding clothes. She looked up and saw the strange look on his face. You've been quiet since you spoke with Nathan, she said. I've made up my mind, Paul said slowly. He's not just a boy with a big imagination. He was sent to us for a reason, to uncover the truth about his own murder. Emma froze, a shirt still in her hands. Paul, are you hearing yourself? A 7-year-old boy, sent to uncover a murder. Yes, Paul said firmly. He remembers how he died, Emma, and he knows who killed him. These men, his former friends, they didn't just steal money. They killed their own friend and left his family in the gutter. Emma sat down on the edge of the couch, her face serious. And what are you going to do? Fight the most powerful men in the country? With what? You don't have the money. And who will listen to you? Your only evidence is the words of a small boy. Paul looked at her, his voice calm. He's not just a small boy. This is not an ordinary mission, and he is not just a child. Nathan knows where he was buried. He remembers every detail. They told the world he drowned, but they never found a body. You know why? Because he was buried secretly. He remembers the exact place. Emma's hands trembled slightly. That's unbelievable. That's not all, Paul added. He said he had already claimed the lottery. He filled a claim form with his name, his mother's name, and his sister's name. It was official. That record must still exist somewhere. Emma's eyes widened. So whoever collected the money must have created a fake identity? Paul nodded. Yes, and if we can find that form and compare it to the final recipient, we'll see the fraud. The money was probably routed through fake companies or shell accounts. If we trace it properly, we might find out how they moved it. Emma held her head in her hands. Paul, this is too much. These men sound dangerous. They're not just businessmen, one is even a senator. They have power. They have connections. If they could kill once, what's to stop them from doing it again? Paul walked to the window and looked outside, deep in thought. I know it's dangerous, but I also saw that woman and her daughter living like beggars in that shelter. No food, no comfort, no hope. While the men who stole their future live like kings. He turned around and looked at his wife. That boy, Nathan. He came back because something in this world still needs to be set right. I believe that now. And if we don't help him, then what kind of people are we? Emma walked over to him and gently touched his arm. Just be careful, Paul. Please, don't rush into anything. I'm scared. Paul smiled sadly. So am I. But we've been chosen. Maybe not to fight with guns or money, but with truth. Nathan came to us for a reason, and I won't stop until the people who killed him pay for what they did. Not just for him, but for that old woman and the girl. They deserve justice." Emma nodded slowly, tears in her eyes. "Then we'll do this together. Just promise me one thing." "What?" "Promise me you'll come back home every night." Paul nodded, holding her hand tightly. "I promise." And deep inside he knew the real battle had just begun. Paul stood outside the police station waiting. His mind was full of questions, but one thing was clear. He couldn't do this alone. He needed help from someone who knew how the system worked, someone he could trust. Moments later, a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out of the building, wearing a casual jacket over his uniform. His name was Detective Mark Dawson, an old friend of Paul's from university days. They hadn't spoken much in recent years, but Paul remembered Mark's honesty and stubborn sense of justice. "Paul?" Mark called out as he approached. "What's going on? You sounded serious on the phone." They walked to a quiet corner of the nearby cafe. Paul leaned in and told him everything, from Nathan's strange memories to the visit to Westmere, and finally, the names of the powerful men his son claimed were his murderers in a past life. Mark listened with a blank expression at first. Then, slowly, a smirk crept across his face. He chuckled, leaned back in his chair, and shook his head. "You've got to be kidding me," Mark said. "Reincarnation? A murdered boy coming back as your son? Paul, that's a good movie script, but not real life." "I'm not joking, Mark," Paul said, his voice firm. "Nathan remembers everything. Names, streets, the house, even where his body was buried." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You're telling me a 7-year-old boy knows where he was buried in a previous life? Come on." "I saw the shelter where his former mother and sister now live," Paul said quietly. "They match everything Nathan said. He didn't imagine this." Mark sighed. "Even if I wanted to believe you, and trust me, I want to, this kind of thing doesn't go anywhere in court. There's no legal path, for my son said he was murdered in a past life." Paul leaned closer. "But what if we can prove it?" Mark narrowed his eyes. "How?" Paul didn't blink. "He says he was buried near the old house he shared with his friends in Westmere. If we find a body there—" Whoa, Mark cut in. "You can't just walk into someone's property and start digging. You need a warrant. And for a warrant, you need real evidence, not childhood stories." "Then I'll get it," Paul said firmly. "Get what?" "The lottery ticket," Paul replied. "Nathan said he hid the original winning ticket. It had his name, his mother's, and his sister's. If it's still there, and we can prove someone else collected the money using fake documents, then we have a case." Mark stared at Paul, silent now. "If you really find that ticket," he said finally, "and it checks out, I'm in. I'll help you. But until then, keep a low profile. These men are dangerous." Paul nodded. "I understand. Just be ready when I call." Mark gave him a long look and stood. "I'm always ready, Paul, but I still think you're chasing a ghost." Paul smiled faintly. "Let's hope this ghost helps us catch the living." Paul sat with Nathan that morning, looking serious. "Nathan," he began, "we need the claim form. If I have it, I can convince Mark, my friend at the police station, to reopen the investigation. We can trace how the money was taken. We might even get permission to dig where you said your body was buried." Nathan nodded slowly. "I remember where I put it." Paul leaned in. "Where?" "It was the day I found out I won the lottery," Nathan began quietly. "I ran home excited. I told my little sister, Lily, that soon we'd be very rich. I didn't give details because I wanted to be sure the money came into the account. I just told her everything would change." He paused. "I wrapped the claim form in plastic, put it in a metal biscuit tin, and hid it behind our old house, under the broken wooden steps at the back. I didn't want to lose it." Paul stood. All right, then we need to get it. But how do we get into the house? He added. The people living there now won't let us dig around. Should we break in? Nathan gave a small smile. You're the adult here, Dad. I'm counting on you. Paul raised an eyebrow. That's not helpful. But then his expression changed. What if we get your sister to go instead? Maybe she can talk to the people in the house and convince them. Nathan's smile faded. That could work. But I can't see her or my mother. Paul was confused. Why not? I don't know, Nathan said. It just doesn't feel right. Something tells me I'm not supposed to meet them again. At least not now. Please, Dad. Tell them anything you want, but don't let them see me. Paul didn't fully understand, but he nodded. He trusted Nathan's instincts now. Paul stood a short distance from the shelter, watching the woman and the young girl. They looked tired, hungry, worn out by life. He sighed deeply. The more he stared, the more his heart ached. How could they have known that their lives were supposed to change years ago? That their son and brother had been murdered for wealth they never got to enjoy? He walked over slowly, carrying a bag of food. "Hello," he greeted gently. The woman looked up and smiled weakly. "Oh, thank you." Paul smiled kindly and handed over the food. "It's nothing." Then he looked at the girl. "Can I speak with you? Just for a moment?" The girl looked at her mother, who gave a slight nod. She followed Paul a few steps away. He spoke softly. "How are you?" "I'm fine," she said, her eyes still focused on the bag of food in her hands. "Can you remember your brother?" She froze. Her eyes lifted and met his. "I don't have a brother. I mean the one who drowned. Elijah." Her voice was sharper now. "Are you asking about my late brother?" Paul nodded slowly. "Yes, Elijah." She frowned deeply. "Why are you asking about him? Who are you?" Paul hesitated. "I'm someone who wants to help you. But I need your help too." "Help us?" she echoed. "How?" Her eyes narrowed suspiciously. "And what exactly do you want with Elijah? He died long time ago?" Paul sighed. "He didn't drown. He was killed. Murdered by his own friends." Lily's breath caught. "What? And the worst part? They took the lottery money he had just won, money meant for your family. For your future." She stared at him, lips slightly parted. "Elijah won the lottery," Paul went on. "He filled out the claim form with his name, your name, and your mum's. Then he hid the form in a biscuit tin behind your old house. But before he could collect the money, his friends poisoned him and dumped his body." Lily's eyes were wide. She remembered the last day she saw Elijah really excited and putting some piece of paper in the biscuit container, but after his death, she had thought it was not anything important. Yet she was in no mood for unnecessary drama. "Please, sir, what exactly is happening? What do you want from me?" "I have someone very special, who remembers everything," Paul easily replied. "Who?" she asked. "How do you know all this? Who are you really?" Paul stepped closer. "Lily, your brother didn't just die. He came back." "What?" she whispered. "He's alive again, in a new form. He remembers everything. Where he lived, the people he loved, how he died, and where he buried that form." Lily looked completely stunned. "You're saying my brother is alive?" Paul nodded. "Yes, in a way you wouldn't believe unless you met him. But he can't see you or your mum. He says it's not time yet. But he sent me." Lily stared at him for a long time. "This sounds insane. Are you sure you're not making this up?" Paul gave a soft, sad smile. "I wish I were. But you know what would prove I'm not? That biscuit tin. It's real. It's still there unless someone's moved it. And once we get it, we can trace everything. The fake identity used to steal the money, the bank account it went into, and maybe even find where Elijah's body was buried." Her lips trembled slightly. She looked away, then back at him. "I remember watching him put the biscuit tin under the step, she said slowly. Are you saying Elijah was killed? But how could he be alive? Sir, I am confused, she said. Paul gently said, a lot of strange things are happening and I am only here because I want to help you. Elijah actually sent me and he has revealed so much to me. Right now I can't go to the house. But you can. Lily hesitated, then took a deep breath. I'll go, she said. I'll go to the house and try to talk to the people there. But if I find out you're lying. You won't, Paul said firmly. Thank you, Lily. You're braver than you know. Later that day, Lily sat quietly on the worn bench outside the shelter, the bag of food untouched beside her. Her hands rested on her lap, but her fingers kept curling and uncurling, as if trying to make sense of everything. She couldn't stop thinking about the strange man who had just spoken to her. Elijah didn't drown, he had said. He was murdered. And not just that, he claimed Elijah had come back and sent him. Lily shook her head slowly. It didn't make sense. Elijah was dead. He had been gone for 7 whole years. Everyone said he drowned in a river, that he slipped. But they never found his body. Never. Not even a shoe. She looked down at her fingers, now trembling slightly. But how did that man know about the biscuit tin? Only she and Elijah knew about that. She remembered that day clearly. Elijah had been so excited. He didn't even tell her what he had written on the paper. He just smiled and said, We'll be rich soon, Lily. Just watch. Then he wrapped the paper and carefully hid it in an old metal biscuit tin behind their house, just under the broken back steps. She never saw him again. The next thing she knew, people were saying he was gone. Drowned. Her heart had broken into pieces that day. And since then, her life and her mother's had been nothing but pain and suffering. She leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, her face in her hands. Tears rolled down her cheeks silently. Life had been so cruel. After Elijah, everything fell apart. Her mother couldn't work anymore. They lost their home. They ended up begging, moving from one shelter to another. Some days they didn't eat. Some days they slept on cold cement floors. And her mother's leg kept getting worse. They had nobody. They had Elijah. But he was gone. And now this man shows up, saying her brother was killed for money. That he had come back through another boy. That the lottery money that could have saved them, was stolen. It was too much to take in. But then again, what if it was true? What if someone did kill Elijah? And what if that paper was still in the tin? She sat up straight and wiped her face roughly with the back of her hand. Her eyes were red and burning. She wasn't sure who the man was. Maybe he did know Elijah. Maybe he was one of the friends who used to hang out with him. Maybe he found out about the money and wanted it all for himself. That's possible. She had to be careful. She didn't know what to believe, but she had to find that biscuit tin. She had to see it for herself. If it was still there, if it really had Elijah's name and hers and her mother's, then something wasn't right. Maybe everything the man said was true, but she wouldn't just hand it over. No, she had to be sure first. Somehow. I'll find a way, she whispered to herself. Her eyes drifted back to her mother, who was still sitting quietly, resting her bad leg. Tired, weary. They deserved better than this. Elijah had been their light, their hope. And when he died, that light had gone out. But maybe, just maybe, it was returning. And if there was even the slightest chance that this could change their lives, then she had to try. She stood up slowly and looked toward the distant streets. She would go to the old house. And maybe, just maybe, she'd find the truth buried right where Elijah left it. A boy with memories of a life cut short, a grieving sister living in despair, and a father chasing clues that defy logic. So far, the truth has begun to crack through the surface. But what exactly is hidden inside that old biscuit tin? And if it's really there, will it be enough to bring powerful killers to justice? Find out in the next chapter of this gripping mystery.